Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to the first West Coast book launch event for Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. Yes, there will be many more. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. I've already had conversations with some folks about additional events. On behalf of the sponsors of this event, well, my name is Marina Kai. I'm with Justice Funders. We're one of the co-sponsors, thank you, along with Northern California Grantmakers, International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, the Whitman Institute, and Swift Foundation. We welcome you all here today. I personally, as someone at Justice Funders, am so excited for this conversation to happen for so many reasons, but one of which is that it just needs to happen, right? It's been a long time coming. And especially for us at Justice Funders, the stuff that Edgar has done, his work, his writing is so much in line with the work that we have done to facilitate a just transition in philanthropy to away from extractive practices toward more regenerative practices so that we can advance a thriving and just world, right? It's a long vision, but we're on our way there, and we're making the changes we need to get there. Because as you know, it's a really pivotal moment, right? Both in our country, but also in philanthropy, where there's a growing recognition that the way that our field has been structured for the last century just is not working. The way that wealth and power and privilege have been accumulated, privatized, and controlled in these institutions with the 1%, the small number of folks in our country who are controlling and making decisions about where philanthropic resources are allocated, actually undermines the efforts of our social movements to advance systemic change around racial, economic, and gender and social justice. And so, because it's a long time coming, we're so excited for Edgar's book to come out. Have folks read it? I'm like halfway through, admittedly, but yes. Great, well if you haven't, or if you have, I'm sure it'll be a thrilling conversation for everyone. We know that this is the community, right, of folks that we want to have in the room to be having these conversations with. So thank you again so much for being here. And I'm going to now pass it over to my colleague Kate Seeley at NCG.
Thank you. Thanks, Marina. Greetings, everyone. I'm Kate. I work with NCG. Thanks for being here. Thanks to you, too, for being here. So I get to introduce Courtney and Edgar, both of whom I count as dear friends. Over the past 10 years, we've gotten, both of us, from 2008. We met I met you in 2008, and you in 2008. So it's been 10 years of kind of understanding these two and what they're up to in the world. I'm going to put that down. I just wrote that, but... So I think, to start with Courtney, Courtney and I met in a cabin in Montana in 2008, and she was just about to put out a book called Do It Anyway, which profiles 8 activists who are just getting on the ground, getting their hands dirty, doing social justice work. And it was then that I started to understand what a force for positive change Courtney is in the world. She's I think I'd describe you as like a solutions-focused, justice feminist storyteller.
Do it.
And she just wrote a really great book called The New Better Off, which is all about thinking about lifestyles that are aligned with more freedom, more fun, more community, more relationship, and less debt, less being tied down, more fluidity. So I urge you guys to check that out. She also really builds a lot of power within the communities that she's a part of. She coaches speakers to share their wealth in the world. She writes for the most amazing podcast, in my view, called On Being. And yeah, just to... If you want to know how to hear a funny story, ask Courtney how she met Krista Tippett. It's hilarious. And yeah, just really grateful to have you here, Courtney. She's a force for good in the world, so check her out if you haven't heard of her already. And Edgar and I met in when I was the local chair of the IFIP chapter here in the Bay Area, and Edgar was on the board. And we were having this was 2008, we were having this huge conversation about, like, is IFIP a big tent organization focused on leadership development, or is it really focused on the development of social justice leaders? And that was when, like, social justice philanthropy was like a bad word, right? You were like gonna scare people off. And to watch you, Edgar, like go through this journey of that inquiry around what it means to be a social justice leader in a field so, as you were talking about, Maria, so nuanced and full of contradictions and paradoxes has just been beautiful. And to have it fruit in this amazing book that is not only that journey, but also your journey of self and finding what that means to you to be a Native force for power within this field is beautiful. So he has a wealth of philanthropic experience behind him, starting in the nonprofit field, health equity, capacity building, worked with the Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust in North Carolina, and then went to Seattle, worked with the Marguerite Casey Foundation, and now is with the Schott Foundation for Public Education by day, and by night he's writing books. So yeah, this was like really easeful to put together because these two are friends, and it's just wonderful to have friends doing good work in the world. So thank you both, and I'm going to pass it over to Courtney, who's going to moderate the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Kate. That was very generous. And this is actually the first time we're ever meeting. So we are new friends, but I'm just hugely adoring of this book and of sort of the way you're moving through the world, and I'm so grateful to talk to you. So one of the things I love about this book is it is this awesome mix of personal narrative, so there really is a memoirish quality to it, and it is also like a big idea book, and it is like a prescriptive, like servicey book, like actually telling people what to do with the thesis that you're putting forth. It is very rare to find a book like this, am I right? It's like, I feel like a lot of people are like, I'm just gonna write the memoir, I just have the big idea, I don't know what to do about it, or I'm gonna write the how-to, and it's like, you did it all, man. That's a lot.
If you know me, I always do the most.
You always do. Okay, so this is not surprising to others. So that's part of what I love about the book. What was the moment when you were like, I have to write this book? Because I'm guessing, like most books, it was like living inside of you for a long time, and you probably felt like someday maybe I should like get all this down on paper. But was there like a turning point when you were like, all right, I got to do it?
Yes. So, well, thanks everyone for having me here, for coming out today. So many friends and familiar faces in the audience, and people that have been along my side for many years doing this work. So honored to be here. You know, for me, starting in philanthropy now 14 years ago, I think once I got really entrenched in the field and was trying to do what I thought was the mission of our foundation, to move resources to communities that needed them the most. You know, when I began to experience how difficult that really was, and then it felt like almost like a facade, you know, that we had this sign out front, but the work that we were doing was really about perpetuating the legacy and you know, of the family, the wealthy family that started the foundation. I was so baffled and astonished that I just wanted to run out and tell everyone, like, this is not real, right? And then I went through a lot of personal things there, like just, you know, I have scars kind of from trying to do what I felt led to do as a good program officer,
Right.
And just asking questions and trying to push forward the right thing, the right agenda to move resources in places where I saw innovative things happening in communities of color. And I was like punished for that, basically. It was like, no, this is what we do. Do not do anything outside of these lines. Do not, you know, you even need to dress this way. You need to assimilate. You're behaving badly by doing, you know, asking those kinds of questions. And so that pain was something that I just kind of held inside because, you know, I was working in a large foundation with a lot of power. And who was I, someone from a very powerless community, to stand up and say that this was wrong? Well, through the years, you know, to follow that, I met so many people who had the same experience. So many people of color, women from marginalized communities who were like, oh no, that also happened to me. I was pushed out, I was rebuked, I was shut down for trying to just move this field forward. And I thought, what a loss. Like, why? This sector that I really love and care about, where there's so much opportunity. We're sitting on $800 billion of assets, so much opportunity to move these resources where they're needed. And the most brilliant folks, the brightest folks in our sector who are really trying to do that with integrity, with a lens of social justice, are punished. And so I was like, I'm mad about this. I'm going to write a book that just exposes all of this shit, and then but then I sat on that for a little while because I'm a talker, not a writer. I'm from the South. I'm Native American. I'm gay. I'm like all the stereotypical things were very chatty. Bad combination.
You're like, I got triple threat chattiness here. Yeah.
And so I'm like loving that people just want to sit and hear me talk. Do this all day.
This is so much easier than writing the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. But I found that in these conversations that again that people had so many similar experiences, and I felt a call to do something that was so strong that I had to obey. And so I feel that writing this book was out of obedience to my ancestors. It was out of obedience to the movement. It was out of obedience to a higher calling that we must embark upon to tell the truth, to peel back the layers of what's really going on in these institutions that control access to wealth, and to reclaim our resources. Those of us from marginalized communities on whose backs this wealth was accumulated and built, are not getting the money. And like, I cannot sit idly by and go to work every day and not do something about that.
That's profound. It's so interesting to me that you use the word obedience in particular, because part of why I found this book so moving was that you were in the belly of the beast. You're still in the belly of the beast. Like, even here you say, I love this sector. I'm like, you love this sector? Like, I have worked in this sector in like a consulting capacity, and I would have a very hard time saying I love this sector. Like, I feel tortured by this sector. Like, that there is this beautiful opportunity to make change, and yet it's so often thwarted by all the things you just talked about. So I find so interesting you're like, that you can say I love this sector and that you're still in it, and yet you also can write a book this like bold and critical and honest. How do you hold that? How do you stay inside? I mean, I think a lot of people would think like, I have to get outside of this whole thing if I'm gonna really write the book I need to write, but you're like in it and you're writing it. Has that been hard to hold? Like, are there people really pissed off at you right now that you work with every day?
Well, not people that I work with every day. I mean, I have to give a shout out to the SHOT Foundation, who's been very supportive. We have a pretty radical board, and part of our mission at SHOT, we're a public foundation. We do want to influence the field to give in a way that is more just. I could not have written this book in any previous job that I was at, honestly. I would have just, if I would have even suggested that I was writing a book, I would have been pushed out immediately for wanting to have a voice that may have been different from the voice of the foundation. But there's a lot of, it's complex, and there are a lot of different, things that I'm holding. But what I think I bring to this is like in my own identity, it's complex, right? And one thing I learned in the book, and it goes into a lot more detail there about my own journey of coming to terms with who I am, is being comfortable with the both and, right? Yeah. I think we're so absolute that we're like, it's this way or that way, it's right or it's wrong. And being a Native American gay man from the South, like, how do I even reconcile who I am when I look in the mirror every day? I spent time in writing this book with some of my elders in North Carolina, and our tribe in North Carolina is very Christian. It's very conservative, and I had a lot of questions about that. Like, how is it that as an indigenous sovereign nation, you can't even be enrolled in our tribe unless you you have to declare which church you're a member of, right? And so I'm like, someone explain all these things to me. And this whole concept of the both and was something that elders shared with me, that we can be completely Native American and we can be completely Christian. We can be all the things. And I'm like, wow, okay. And so I've learned that I don't have to necessarily be one way or the other. I can hold multiple identities and wear multiple hats. And if you come from a poor community of color, you learn to do that, right? You learn to wear multiple hats. We've all had 5 jobs since we were 14. But I think the other thing is that when you there are many times where I'm getting out of this sector through the years, and I have left 2 jobs thinking that I would not probably get another job. And the verdict is out. When this book gets out, we'll see like what happens, right? I may never work again in this sector. But I keep coming back because what I learned also in the process of writing this book is that money is my medicine, and we can talk more about that. But I've learned that what I love doing is getting resources and moving resources into communities that are hurting, into communities that have been under-resourced and marginalized intentionally by this sector and by policies and systems in our history. And so what really feeds my soul is like when I get that money there.
Right.
There's, with all the hard work of explaining and advocating inside the walls of these foundations and justifying and rewriting things and the back and forth, when you get that check to the right people, that magic moment of like, wow, these are the people who need this money because they're doing this work, it is something that is just such a rush for me. It makes me so excited because I know in that moment things are happening as they should. And so it is complex, and I think you know, if I went to work in any other sector, I think a lot of the same dynamics in philanthropy are also there.
Right.
It's not like I could leave philanthropy and go work in another sector and not experience white supremacy or any of those types of dynamics that show up in the workplace. But I have felt that being on the inside actually helps me dismantle, disrupt, question, and push back in ways that make it a little bit, you know, it's an advantage point that I have being on the inside versus being on the outside trying to apply that pressure.
Yeah. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking like you can hold this complexity, as you said, maybe in part because it's your own identity is complex and it's rooted in that. But also I hear this kind of idea of obedience to the right people. Like you felt an obedience to your ancestors. You feel an obedience to the people when you actually get the check to them. I think, you know, one of the things you write about is it was pretty awesome to get like a salary and have a car. And I think there are a lot of people inside the sector who think it's too big of a risk for me to critique it because this is where how I pay my rent, right? And that's real.
Right.
Like we forget that that's really why more corruption and dysfunction isn't exposed, because people are economically dependent on the very sector that they would be exposing, right? So that's also part of why I admire so deeply, you know, that you have found a place where you can do this and pay your rent and like all of this is happening at once. To me is actually more inspiring than almost anything, that this can exist within the sector as opposed to leaving it to write it. So you've been on the road a little bit talking about it already. Mm-hmm. Have there been any really surprising reactions?
You know, I think I'm just surprised that people are really resonating with the message in the book, right? So, of course, I have a fear of throwing a party and no one shows up, right? So the same thing, I'm going to write this book and no one's going to care, right? And so what I am finding is that I think we're in a special moment right now in philanthropy, in the social impact space where we want to have real conversations. Like, we cannot continue with the status quo, with doing the way that we've always done things. And I'm finding, you know, I was in a pretty conservative space speaking yesterday with a bunch of funders who are not like the funders in this room, and I had this inclination to water down my message a little bit. I'm like, they may not be ready for some of the things that I want to bring. But I've found that even in that environment, when I brought that truth there, people were curious and they wanted to hear more. And I think there is just a real desire to do things differently and a real urgency. Like, not beyond the desire, like there's a must. Mm-hmm. Philanthropy, I think if it doesn't change, if it doesn't progress or evolve, it's gonna just fold in on itself. Mm-hmm. It has to evolve and become relevant and meaningful. And I think that the movement has sort of infiltrated philanthropy, right? We are on the inside now. There are many people like me who are working inside the walls of foundations, many of you in this room, the work that you're doing. So there's no going back to how things used to be. Mm-hmm. And I'm just excited that I feel that people are rising to the occasion. Yeah. And just really embracing this frame around what can be different when we begin to think about the colonizing aspects of our work and how we might be perpetuating and causing harm to communities versus helping to facilitate healing and restoration.
Right. Let's get into the idea of the book, because it looks like not that many of you have actually read it yet. It is, as I said, completely worth reading. But will you sort of give us like the main thrust of the book? And especially, I thought your distinction between internal and external colonization was really important, and something that I'm sure a lot of people in this room have thought about, but maybe some haven't. Will you explain that?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, colonization is like, wow, right? It's what I'm finding, of course we're not taught, right? In schools, we're not taught about colonization in the way that it really happened, right? It's glorified, and there are things that I learned in writing this book. For example, there was a survey in the UK where they asked folks there how they felt about colonization. At one point, the UK controlled 2/3 of the world, the British Empire, and even current day, folks feel like 70% of folks there said we're very proud of that. We feel like the world is better off because of us colonizing the world. And so there is a sense of pride around colonization. And Will and I were in Portugal earlier this year, and the monuments to all the colonizers, so bizarre. And so we have, first of all, just a mindset about colonization that is so damaging. And so I think there is sort of a primer about colonization and what it really is, and that folks, I think, are experiencing for the first time, and who have not really understood our country's history. And these are very, very smart people, well-educated people who are like, I have not understood the history of this country this way. And as it pertains to wealth and money, underlying those motivations of colonization especially. And so in that breakdown of colonization and understanding all the things that happen, and the motivation and of dividing, of separating, of conquering, of fear, it resonates so present day, right? And so when I talk about colonization, I'm not just talking about what happened 500 years ago or 200 years ago. I'm talking about what happened as recent as yesterday, right? Like, we are not in a post-colonial society. And 500 years ago, when the point of contact was made in the U.S., I think of that colonization as this virus that has existed since then, that shows up in our policies, it shows up in everything that we do, and it shows up especially in philanthropy and banking and finance. That's a part of the DNA or fabric of this country that we have to understand in order to begin to heal and dismantle that. And so to your question, Courtney, about the different kinds of colonization, what I learned in writing this book is there is sort of an internal kind of colonization and an external type of colonization, and different tactics are employed, strategies to colonize. One is to sort of build walls to keep people from coming in once you've colonized, right? And the other is to build a wall to keep you inside and not to get outside of those colonization. And so where that shows up is in, historically has been in how public education was constructed in this country, our immigration policy, our policing and criminal justice system, and the surveillance. All of these are products and symptoms of colonization and a white supremacy that wants to dominate and control and continue to keep wealth concentrated with a certain small group of people in this country. And so on the flip side of that, when we're thinking about moving resources or having movement strategies to sort of get at that, we can look at the different ways that we were colonized and then organize and move resources in a way that speak to those different layers of internal colonization and external colonization. That's getting really deep into the weeds. You probably need to read a book to really unpack that a little bit more.
No, I think that was
great. It's in it.
A great primer. One of the other things I was like, holy shit, when you read something, you're like, I can see this in like 10 different ways in my own professional life, was when you wrote about the drama triangle theory.
Yes.
Will you explain that? Because I just feel like it's so useful. Ever since you taught me about the drama triangle, I'm like, it's connected to the savior dynamic, which of course so many people like myself, who's still trying to examine my own white saviorness, like those of us who are attracted to this sector have all this like personal unpacking to do about like why are we so attracted to the sector and how are we like identifying with it and where does our egos come in, Anyway, will you talk about the drama triangle?
Yeah, I mean, in short, in the drama triangle, it basically says when there's trauma, because what I talk about in terms of the colonization of this country is the trauma that now exists, right? And so this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with ongoing colonization and ongoing trauma from what has happened and what continues to happen. And when there is trauma, when there's abuse, in this drama triangle, you have sort of a cast of characters, right? You have someone who is the victim, you have someone who is the perpetrator, and then you often have a savior. And philanthropy often kind of fills that role of the savior. But when you dig into this theory and this research, what you often find in these saviors is they are actually also have components of the abuser, the perpetrator. And there's trauma inside of the savior that is causing them to, one, want to save, right? And then two, the way that they go about saving can be very damaging. And so from that, how I apply that to philanthropy is like, one, we need to question our motives and intentions, right? Like, why are we in this business? Why do we feel inclined that we are the ones? What gives us the right to be in the position to go out and save communities, right? And that question is so pertinent to not just funders of philanthropy, wealthy folks in this country, but also NGOs and other organizations that often parachute into communities with the gospel, right, of their way of doing things. And so, so I think what we take away from that is like questioning our credibility and our legitimacy in doing that and making sure those intentions are pure and that there are not abusive, colonizing aspects within us that are, coming out and being demonstrated in the work. And it shows up in a very subtle way, right? No one in philanthropy is a bad person, right? No one is like, I'm going to work today to perpetuate white supremacy. Like, no one really feels that way. But that colonizing virus that is inside of our institutions and inside of our culture does find its way, and it has to be examined so that we are not, perpetuating the white savior dynamic. There's a book called No More White Saviors, if you haven't read that one. That's also a great one, Jordan Flannery. And so, it's really making sure that we're just very clear in the ecosystem of, who is the savior, what makes you the savior, just because you have the resources. If you are going to help, what are your intentions? What are your strategies in doing so in a way that is not actually inflicting harm on folks who have already been victimized by the system? Right.
And for like white folks in particular, there's sort of, okay, I don't want to be the perpetrator, right? Most of us who count ourselves as progressive are clear on that.
Right.
But if you want to be the savior, that's also something to examine. And I've particularly been thinking about this, probably folks in this room have also been thinking or paying attention to the conversation around Anand Giridharadas' book, Winners Take All. So I read that and I've interviewed Anand, and I've been watching who tweets his stuff out, and I'm like, what? Like, did you read the book? Like, you were like a central example of exactly what he's arguing against. So there's all this kind of signal boosting going on about some of these critiques. I'm pretty sure your book is too bold and too explicit for people to do this, but it's interesting to me just the way in which, like, there's that level of I don't want to be the perpetrator, and then there's a level of I want to be identified as the good guy. And how do we actually push past the signal boosting, past the, like, as you put in, we did this Q&A for Bright Magazine, past the, like, another conversation about equity, where you go home at night and you feel like, oh, I was in a conversation about equity. Like, I've done my part. It's like, like, we have to, like, actually change practices, and we have to actually be uncomfortable, and we have to take what feel like risks to us. We have to trust people that we wouldn't naturally trust. We have to, like, we have to offend people that we really want to like us. Like, we have to do all these things that actually feel kind of shitty in the moment to make change, not just, like, signal boost that, like, I read this and, like, I'm feeling really good about myself, right? So that's part of why I love that you get to the prescriptive level, which is, I want to talk through these. You lay out 7 steps of healing. Grieve, apologize, listen, relate, represent, invest, and repair. So that's a lot. Like, it's, to the point of discomfort. There's a lot of discomfort in there. For people in this room who are going to leave today and be in this sector and be thinking, like, how do I actually apply this and not just signal boost that, like, I came to this lecture, what are like first steps that you recommend people do? What are the first conversations, or what are the first parts of their own practice that they might look at?
Good question. I just want to say one thing about equity, because in philanthropy, it is a buzzword now, right? And I'm glad that we're talking about it. It's the theme of every conference. But it is. And, talking is the first step. But what folks have to understand, even those of us who are enlightened and woke and all those things, right? When we're talking about equity, if you have been privileged and have been, sitting in that place of privilege for so long, when you begin to operationalize equity and implement equity, it actually feels like oppression, right? When you've been the one getting more, equity actually means you have to start getting less, right? And so how many folks, even white progressive folks here in the movement, are going to be able to not just read this book, preach the gospel, stand and be an ally, but are actually willing to give up something and to take a step back so that others can have more. That is what equity really is. It is not equality. Equality means we all get the same, and that's a good thing. Like, that's fair. But when we're really talking about equity, that means that folks who have historically gotten less need to get more to catch up. And so we are reallocating resources or redistributing wealth in a way that feels, to some folks, will feel like oppression and very uncomfortable. And so are we willing to be uncomfortable? Are we willing to not just have a token seat at the table or at a board for a person of color, but to actually have some people to step off to make room for others? That is what, that is about ownership and about power, and that is super uncomfortable for a lot of people. Now, in terms of what you all can do, it is 7 steps, it is a lot, and I was a little reluctant to have 7 steps, right? But publishers really like you to have, like, right? Edgar, 7 steps, right? But we will not erase or undo 500 plus
I want to see, like, can you make an infomercial parody that's like Edgar's 7 steps for philanthropy?
Oh my God.
That'd be hilarious.
So it's really about, in 7 steps, we will not undo what has been done, right? But what we can do through this, the 7 steps essentially are bringing an indigenous restorative justice model of healing to our sector. And so in order to sort of begin that, we all have trauma, and as a result of whatever family you're from, whatever you've been through in your life, your history, and colonization has traumatized all of us, people of color and white people. Like, we all have that pain that is there because of this system. And so what this book invites people to do is, one, to examine that and to actually grieve that, to like sit in that place of discomfort, not jump. It's very like white dominant culture to be like, I'm going to just jump and implement this. But what it invites you to really heal from these deep seated wounds, you have to sit in the belly of the beast and like just sit there. And if you've been through grief in your life, I'm very fortunate because I have not been through a lot of personal loss in terms of like family members. I recently did lose a pet that I love very, very much. And when I lost my dog, my life shut down. I tried to go to work the next day, like, I'm just going to keep moving on and doing things. I'm going to just push through this. And I literally got to work and was shut down. I could not function. Yeah. It had such a strong hold of me that it didn't matter about the deadlines, it didn't matter about the dishes and this thing. Like, I literally had to just sit in it and deal with it until it chose to move through my body and allow me to move on. Our history is so complex, and the suffering that's going on in communities, until we are able to, if you haven't experienced that personally, you have to like grieve for your role in all of this happening, right? We all have had a role to play in lifting up a bad system, or perpetuating, or allowing that to happen. So, that is the first step, is really understanding what particular role you have played, and what role can how can it be different. And so I tell stories.
Can I pause you there for 1 second? Because I recently went to the lynching memorial in Montgomery, and I have been to some memorials, but I don't think I've been to that many. And I went to the museum first, which is totally worthwhile and interesting, but I was totally in my head. I was like, interesting how they put this here, and okay, I'm following this. And then I went to the memorial, and I was just like, oh, like, it was just this like embodied, like, deeply disturbing, important experience. And I think that's part of what's hard about this sector is it's such a heady sector. Like on the one hand, we're actually working with these deeply embodied, painful, emotional, spiritual issues, but it's a very like, what are your metrics and evaluation? And like, you know, and so it when I read that step in the process, I was like, I don't know if I trust us to do that. Like, where in this sector are the spaces where people are actually acknowledging their bodies or their emotions? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, do you see that happening anywhere? Are you hopeful that it will happen
I'm hopeful.
more?
You know, I think that, you know, a call that I have to the field is to allow us to feel things, allow us to be and to be spiritual and to understand that, you know, the issues we're grappling with as funders and wanting to solve in communities. It's people, it's philanthropy, the love of humankind. Like, you know, if we can't experience love and grief and all those emotions as human beings, like our strategies will never work. They're just, you know, just as stale, evident theories of change or like whatever we come up with, you know, in an ivory tower that has no type of connection. And, you know, I've been saying this even with a lot of the movements that are happening around criminal justice. For example, restorative justice is becoming a thing that has taken off. And that came from an indigenous community, but what has happened in terms of it being implemented is that people took the spiritual piece out. And the reason that has worked in our native communities is because we go through the steps, but there is a spiritual component. And so we have to understand that we are complex people, that we have body, soul, and spirit. And those are elements that can inform and bring life to our work in ways that can really resonate. And so, you know, I think that we have to start as the people in this room, as the choir who are on board, you know, with doing this work in a different way. We have to bring those conversations and be bold. And you know, and it's not easy to kind of be the person to bring that up or to pause from the rush of everything that we're trying to do as funders, to be the one to say, slow down, let's think about this, let's connect with the heart of what we're trying to accomplish here, let's connect with the humanity of it all. And you may become a target for being that one, right? But it's really the only way forward. And quickly, one of the things that I think is resonating is helping folks who don't think that way to see their own pain, right? And you know, I think in some of the work I've been doing with very wealthy folks in this country and the conversations I've been having is, you know, I've shared a little bit about my story and my experience as a Native American, but I'll also kind of help them see that the system is not serving you well. Right. Philanthropy as it currently exists is not serving you well. If you really care about your legacy and you know, and the, you know, what you know, influence you're leaving from your family's wealth, you need to listen and identify your own pain and how that can inform your practice. Because I promise you, regardless of how wealthy someone is in this country, I've seen the pain that they have, and sometimes it shows up as white guilt, and it shows up as them being more isolated and standoffish because they don't know where to begin their own healing and liberation. And so what I'm asking is for us to do our work, but also to make space for others, right? Make space for people who are not like us, who may not be as far along on their journey, to have these kinds of conversations. And I think we'll be surprised at how receptive people might be when we give them a place to come to the table.
Yeah. It's very generous of you. It is. It's very generous. I mean, some of those kinds of encounters can be like re-traumatizing because you're like, oh God, call me, you know, read this book and then let's talk, because it's hard to have those conversations sometimes. I'm going to ask one more question and I'm going to you, so be thinking what your questions are. One of the things you write, there's so many things, so many questions I could ask you, but I want to say, you write, what if foundations had to apply for the honor of funding communities and projects rather than the other way around? I'm obsessed. Is anyone doing that? Or what would it look like? Is anyone doing that? Or what would it look like if someone was doing that? Can someone do that, please?
You know, it's going to take a major shift in the paradigm. I mean, there are definitely amazing models out there of folks who are trying to democratize and share power, and groups in this room that are doing amazing work in that space. You know, it's really hard. In writing this book, I talked with a lot of movement leaders, nonprofit leaders, And I was really sad in a sense to when in some of those conversations to hear from folks who are dismantling all kinds of unjust systems, but when it comes to philanthropy, their imagination was very limited. And I say that one of the spoils of colonization is actually our ability to imagine, because this system is so messed up that it's like, well, it's messed up, but I'm on this life raft that has holes in it, but I can't poke a hole in it because it's all I have, right? And so we just have to get to a place where, can we be empowered enough, especially those of us who are from marginalized communities, can we get to a place where we can just be bold and understand that these are our resources, push back against like this scarcity mentality, because this mentality of scarcity is a product of colonization. It was intended, intended policies and practices that have been implemented to divide and to make us think that we don't have enough and that we're not worthy, or we're not, we always undersell and ask for less than we really need. And but also to be bold, like, am I willing? I'm sitting up here and this might look glamorous that I wrote this book, but I've had a lot of scary moments, right? Where I'm like, here I am, I'm gonna take this pen, I'm gonna pop this raft, I don't know what's gonna happen, right? And I may never get a job again, I may be blacklisted, but I feel so passionate about that this is the right thing to do that I'm just gonna blow it up. I'm just gonna do it and we'll see what happens. And the world and the universe has always caught me, and life goes on and things have been fine. And so we have to just, get bold and courageous. What are we really doing this for? Are we doing this to maintain the nonprofit, complex and keep people employed? And trust me, I know I've been at ED of a nonprofit. I know sometimes you have to make those compromises because you need money to make payroll. But we have to we don't have the luxury in the times that we're living in right now, under this particular administration especially, to just compromise what we know is the right thing to do in our organizations and in our, and what is our legacy, right? What is the legacy that we want to leave? And so, I dream of the day of where nonprofits are, sitting behind the table and funders are lining up because your work is so magical that they want to be the one to fund you. And I think that, that's possible.
And fund you for like 50 years, not
yes.
like we're all in love with you for the next, because that already happens.
Right.
There's already the like darling who gets, all the
Yes.
money for 5 years and then
Yeah.
everyone's like moves
Yeah.
on to the next darling. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So an actual long-term, that would be amazing. Okay, I'm sure you have questions for this brilliant, brave human. I think we have a mic here. So maybe just tell us your name and, where you're coming from, and then a question. And I would appreciate questions.
Yeah.
They have question marks at the end, and they're usually pretty concise so we can hear as many voices as possible.
Thank you.
Here comes another one.
Got another one. It's not on. We'll figure it out.
Come to the front.
Neither working.
Shall I just shout?
Yeah.
Or you could have mine. Do you want to take mine? Because I'm not answering.
So my name is Kristen. I work with Asian Americans and and I wanted to thank you for writing this book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. I was really curious. In the beginning, Edgar, you mentioned that
Unless philanthropy changes, that it will essentially fold in on itself and become obsolete. And I wondered if you could expand on that, because I can't imagine how it could fold in on itself unless, for example, every foundation decided to start paying out like 20% instead of 5%.
Well, I think that should happen, for sure. I think it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of NPR interviews, right, where I'm talking to people who are not like people in this room, right, who are realizing that we have foundations in this country. A lot of people just don't even know, right? And they're learning because of the last election. They heard about the Clinton Foundation and the Trump Foundation. And so I just think that more and more, because we're sitting on this wealth, as times get harder, somebody is going to come for this money, right? I've heard stories, and there's some in the book where there have been community groups who have done direct actions on foundations, demanding resources. The MacArthur Foundation was one in Chicago where a community said it's your fault that black folks are dying in the streets because you put $0 on the south side of Chicago. You're giving out $1 million prizes everywhere. Right here in your own community, you're not funding. And so I think that, that's some of that boldness that I think we have to begin to hold foundations accountable regardless of maybe the fear of the consequences. So I think that, even I was talking to Anand today, and we were actually talking about the Trump administration has come for, come after the charitable status tax, right? They may come back. The one time where you see all foundations agreeing and coming together is on Foundations on the Heel Day, where they go to save and keep things just as they are. And I don't know, it's an annual battle to kind of keep this system in place. And I do think that folks are going to begin to disrupt that. We could have the opportunity to do the right thing and get ahead of that and begin to actually put money in communities and not hoard wealth and sit on the resources. And if not, I just think I see a day where folks are going to come for it.
Hello, I'm Shawnee with the Women's Foundation of California. I just have a simple question. Can you talk a little bit more about your vision for reparations and what that looks like in a practical sense?
Yeah, really good question. I think that I'm not a reparations expert, and I read a lot about it. There's only been sort of like one policy that I could find that's ever been brought up to Congress as like a package of something the U.S. could do. What I think philanthropy can do is actually fund some stuff to help us figure that out, right? Like we can be risk capital or a laboratory to fund some reparations or to fund some projects, even in small communities, that show that it works, that it can be done, and maybe that's something that can happen at a larger scale. And so I make some radical calls for foundations to do some stuff like that, like actually just taking 10% of their assets and immediately turning them over to communities of color, like as a tithing, right? And that seems kind of far-fetched for some, but it's not, in the scheme of things, it's 10% of your assets. And then we can figure out, those of us that are resilient, we can figure out what to do with that money to fund our communities and put that wealth back. But there are lots of, Black-owned and POC-led financial institutions. I talked to some folks earlier in the room who are doing things to put capital in communities, and there are structures there. But I think philanthropy should lead in helping to figure that out.
I think that's one more thing.
First, I just want to say thank you for coming. You're like my new favorite person. But I had a question. So aside from philanthropy, do you have any advice for us as individuals where we should put our wealth?
Yes, in communities of color. I think money is something that we all have a relationship with, right? And depending on your story, where you're from. And so I think that we need to think about our own, did I go out?
Yeah.
Okay. Our own healing, testing, oh, there it is. Our own healing, our journey that we might need to make around money. And in some cases, that's kind of recovering from a poverty mindset of never having it and feeling traumatized by that and wanting to hoard wealth and not actually help others. Or decide what is your spirit of generosity going to look like. And so, all giving is great. Fund your passion, right? But I think I talk about money as medicine, and I think if the best use of money is putting money into where the hurt is the worst. And where the hurt is the worst is in communities of color.
First, let me say I love this conversation is happening in the Google building. And I'm Joe from the Schmidt Family Foundation, so we're trying to redistribute some of that Google money as much as possible to some of the efforts that you've talked about. But the question I have is, I was saddened to hear that you've felt pushed out at other organizations prior to your current one. So as a foundation manager, that's like my worst nightmare, right? That we do all this work to attract a high quality person of color on staff, and then they feel not comfortable or welcome. So what would you say is the most important thing as a foundation manager to keep in mind to build the right container and organization so that all feel welcome, and that we can have people at the table making the decisions that will lead to some of the outcomes that you're talking about?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I talk quite a bit about this in the book because philanthropy has been obsessed with DEI, right? And we had the D5 coalition, if you know what that is. And I think we've done, at one point we were doing pretty good around diversity. Our numbers were trickling up, but then they kind of started last year, the data, it went down. And so there's a few reports out there, for example, the exit interview by IFIP, the Association of Black Foundations Executives, that interview people who have left philanthropy. So check out that report. There's a lot, people kind of shared why they left. And what it comes down to is that I think most foundations have such a strong white dominant culture. And if you read about what are the elements of white dominant culture and how they show up, and then you multiply that by 100, that's how it is a foundation, kind of. And so it just literally feels like it's hard to breathe sometimes as a person of color working in these institutions. The type of, and I'm still hearing stories current day where folks are being asked not to wear their hair a certain way at work, or to take off their native jewelry before they get there because it makes others feel uncomfortable. So at minimum, allow people to, of course, dress professionally, but to also dress in a way that reflects their culture or whatnot. I think, examine your culture and also get to a place where you can have those honest conversations with people of color who work in your organization. If someone had come to me as a manager and said, listen, we want to make sure you're successful here, we want to make sure you belong here, what can we do here to make sure that you're successful and that you thrive as a professional? I would have dropped dead if someone would have said that to me. So if you even have that conversation and you make it a safe space to receive that feedback from people in your organization, I think that's a beautiful start.
Hi, my name is Jose. I don't work in philanthropy. I do work for a nonprofit that supports movement building infrastructure, but I work mostly on the operation and the admin side, so I'm really mostly here as a community organizer. I'm kind of curious about the definition of what we mean, for example, to invest in communities of color, right? Because as a community organizer with an orientation towards organizing for base building, civic engagement, from the community perspective, when you're trying to do that work, a lot of what emerges in that process of learning from the community is that what the community means by investment is something that is a little bit different than what some of the nonprofit community philanthropies investing in. The community's literally talking about economic investment so they can accelerate the development of infrastructure that will allow them to build just, equitable communities, right? So they're already sitting with the solutions to the situation in which they're in. And so being relatively new to the nonprofit sector, to understanding philanthropy and grant making, and then understanding the community story, it's if I wanted to look for an alignment between the two, it's then you get into that 95% territory, right? That MRI, that PRI money, that is really hard to unlock. Partly because of definition, what do these institutions mean by mission-related investments, project-related investments? That becomes very complicated for the community to answer that question. And then you get into structural things we've created ourselves through the accounting industry, finance, and the mechanisms and the what those institutions use to assess a community proposal for something that is going to allow them to build out these projects that will allow them to build their communities with autonomy, self-determination. And I'm like, I don't really know what the question is. It's just like a curiosity of like,
I'm looking for
what is that bridge that needs to be built? What is that story that needs to be told on paper? Like, how do we find that alignment to unlock that, you know? Because what we're looking for is something that is not even recognized, right? When we talk about equity, where I'm like, think of this in 10 or 15 years. If you gave this community this money right now,
right?
The standards that we live by don't even recognize that if it's not quantified.
Right, right. No, the point that I think you're making about solutions already existing in the community is one that I talk about quite a bit, right? And coming from a Native community where we have been resilient and survived for hundreds of years in spite of a lot of stuff, you know, I know that my community has a vision for who we want to be. And if we had the resources, there's no lack of capacity, right? We have capacity and then the knowledge to do it, but the lack of resources. And so I think, you know, where I push philanthropy is to actually go into communities and fund that, not to go in and direct, you know, bring their logic models and enforce their way of thinking about what a community needs to develop and thrive, but to actually sit and listen. We are terrible at listening and horrible, and so I think that's a part of the healing process that funders have to go through, is learning to listen and listen to these stories. I call it listening in color in the book, because I think there's a way of listening that is like a white dominant way of listening that is like, I'm listening, but I'm about to tell you. I'm about to tell you what I'm going to tell you anyway, right? And so like truly listening, and then listening to understand and listening to support what is already there. The resilient, amazing, you know, solutions that exist in the community that folks have come together and built. And that's what we should be funding. So. One last question.
Hi, my name is Nolan. I'm with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland. Hi, so I work in the development universe, and there are a lot of folks in this space who have like drank the Kool-Aid and are really like happy with the colonized version of philanthropy.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be introduced to your talk at the GIFT conference. And so I was left wondering, for folks who are not inside philanthropy but who are adjacent to it, like, is there work that we can do to support y'all on the inside? Things that we can do to boost your credibility as you're calling for the decolonization of wealth? Like, what does someone do to support somebody who's inside a foundation when we're sort of on the outside?
Yeah, no, I get it. And I remember that conversation at the GIFT conference where I think development folks and fundraisers are struggling, right? Like they need to develop, they need to get this money to be good at their jobs and play this game. But at the same time, they want to be liberated and see a different way of flow of resources. And so, you know, I think it's tough. It's complicated. I think that as development folks have an opportunity to think about your fundraising as donor activism and helping to bring funders around, maybe connecting your funders with other funders that are more enlightened about this way. You know, it's challenging because I know that you have to get those dollars. You know, I don't know. I don't have a really good answer. I would say I know there's some stuff in the book that will probably speak to what you're getting at, and if there's any way to think about your role as a fundraiser and how you might be contributing to the cycle, although you did not create this dance, this cycle. I blame you know, banking and finance for that. But we can find ways to push back on it from wherever we sit. And unfortunately, as fundraisers, you're often in the position of less power, but you still could be bold in those conversations and try to push. I think Will's a great fundraiser. Maybe you have something to add.
Can I have a quick question?
Sure.
Quick.
Partner privilege.
So I'm Will, and I'm privileged enough to call Edgar my love. But I was just wondering if you might share with folks in the room. The concept of the book cover.
Oh. Yeah, sure. I'll make it short because I know we're at time, and I think there's wine. And stories get better. So I think I had an experience, as my own personal journey of decolonizing myself. My identity as a Native is complicated. Being in the other box and having that other box being told it's not a real box or under threat at all times, and so just trying to figure that out. And when I left my first foundation job, I took a job running a Native organization in North Carolina. And I was like in the trenches, grassroots, and dealing with a lot of trauma in our communities. It was really, really tough. And so I went to this Native conference, and there was a medicine man at this conference it was at like a Marriott hotel. You can go into this room and meet with this medicine man. And my own way of I'm like colonized. So I'm like, what do I do in there? What's going to happen? I had to get someone to teach me because I didn't know. I wasn't taught. And so I was very excited about it, and but also kind of terrified. But I had heard that if you're really fortunate when you meet with a medicine man, they might give you a Native, your Indian name. And I was like, oh, I really want that to happen because I don't have an Indian name. I think it would be really cool. So long story short, I go into the room, I meet with this man. It was it was just an amazing experience. And at the end, he said that he wanted to give me an Indian name or spiritual name. And the name was Nagani Binashe, which means leading bird. And so I was like, oh, that's so cool. Can you write that down for me? That went to I don't know, right? I haven't taken a Jibberway course or anything. So, and then I was like, is that what kind of bird? Right? Is it like a big, strong eagle or a little tiny bear? I want to be. And he said, it's actually a bird that flies in V formation. And he said, and you're the bird that is, which is not exactly that picture, but I could put too many birds on there. And so, but when you think about, if you've read Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, she talks about birds in there a lot. But the bird that flies at the front of this V formation is the leading bird. But the leadership style in which this bird has is often that they fly around to the back, right? Like this leader knows that they are codependent on the other birds. There's a science behind the velocity and the wingspan, and it's amazing when you see them flying that they just know how to do this. But often the bird flies around to the back and pushes others to the front. And so today I'm sitting up front and I get to be the leader. But there are many times where I'm in the back and I'm pushing, right? And so I think that's the type of leadership that we have to have in order for us to win, right? We have to know that we're all connected, that our interdependence is not negotiable. We have to make room for each other, have grace, and just support one another. We are too critical of each other as a movement, trying to see who is the most progressive and overanalyze one another. We have, let's show some grace and support and whatever we're all trying to do in this movement to move us forward. And so, so this bird is just a symbol of that type of spirit that I wanted to bring to this message.
That's awesome. And the epigraph, you should know, you'll get your copy and have it signed. Are you going to sign books?
Sure.
You can get your copy and have it signed, so you'll see the epigraph is none other than Beyonce. And it says, if we are going to heal, let it be glorious. Which I love because this work of transforming philanthropy and decolonizing wealth, and it can all feel like a slog, right? And very uncomfortable and very challenging and real long term. And the book is filled with the word love. If I could put it in a computer and be like, what was the most often used word? Love would be one of them, right? You used it a lot. So can you just say one closing word about how do we make this joyful? How do we make this feel like something we're all doing together in this, it's always going to feel good, but it can't always feel bad or it's not going to happen, right? So where does the joy come in?
God, I don't know. I just think that just persevering, if you're in a tough place right now, because we all have been, knowing on the other side of that is going to be a better day. This sounds like really my southern preachery, whatever thing is kicking in. But it really is. Life is too short, and we have to. The joy is what sustains us. The joy is our strength. And if we cannot be happy, I think about you know, if we have the right way, if we have the gospel, if we have something that we think the rest of the world needs to hear, if we don't seem happy with it, why are they going to want it? Why would they want this if we're not happy? And so we are going to, you know, fight. We're going to push forward. But just allow yourselves to feel the joy and the love of this work and what it's really about. That is a powerful force that I do believe is going to defeat. It's going to defeat the darkness. And so, so in the time that we have together here, you guys just love on each other, take care of each other, and let that joy fill you up. You know?
Love it. Perfect. Perfect. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to say one thing. For the books, and there's t-shirts for sale, I want to say this because it's really important. Not only am I trying to contribute to this conversation that you all are having and leading as well, I'm trying to actually use this as a way to generate resources, right? So all of the proceeds from this book, from these t-shirts, are supporting the Generation Indigenous Fund, which is a fund that we started at Native Americans and Philanthropy to support Native youth organizing. So please, like, buy up everything. It's not going to make me rich at all. It's supporting the movement. So thank you in advance for that.
Let's give these two hands like a really people. Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Pia Infante. I'm the trustee and co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, one of the hosts here. I was voluntold that on a call that I was not on, that I would be closing and having to follow this magnificence. So I have the honor of just saying a few words. On behalf of Northern California Grantmakers, Justice Funders, International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, and the Whitman Institute, all of which are, I would say, groups that are in different ways trying to promote the radical, loving change that has been discussed so beautifully here today. I will say that I am probably the only out queer Filipina pregnant executive director of a foundation that I know of. I wanted to sort of wrap up by saying, I'm incredibly blown away by this book, by you, by this conversation, and I know that in times like this. I just want to say, Courtney, I will be taking a selfie with Edgar and Will and signaling that I was here. But in addition to that, I wanted to just offer a few ideas for actionable. Like, what's actionable? Many of us in this room, you're in this room because you're already actionating along the lines of, let's not say equity, but let's say love and justice, let's say radical liberation, let's say freedom. But I wanted to think about it in a few different tiers. So if you're in the position where you're in any way responsible for who gets to sit at the board level, or who gets chosen as a CEO or an executive of a foundation, private, public, corporate, let's remember that who is actually in the seats makes a difference. Because you can DEI train someone for like 30 years, but they will just make different choices than an Edgar, And the second thing I want to say is sometimes people get confused, I think. When you say people of color, sometimes people will just then hire the first person of color they see on the street and say, tell me what to do. So I just want to qualify that, yes, we need to look at leadership of communities of color. And when we're looking at both who sits in these seats and who we fund in the nonprofit sector, I would ask a couple of questions. Who is this person accountable to? So in my role as a trustee of an endowment, I don't feel accountable to the endowment. You know what I mean? I feel accountable to, my indigenous Pinay farmers, in the Philippines trying to live under Duarte. So you might want to ask whether you're giving a grant or whether you're hiring someone, who are you accountable to at the end of the day? Right? And yes, we have to pay our bills, like we have to have babies and have bassinets, I guess. But the point is, it's not just an unequivocal, and I think that happens with DEI training. You sort of get this impression that if you have like a person of color-y looking person somewhere at the front of the ship, right, then you're cool. You're signaling, right? You're signaling that you're woke or whatever.
But the quality of that person and who they're accountable to and what kind of leadership they're going to provide is really critical. And I think sometimes for white folks, it's really scary to ask that question, because then it's like, am I being racist by asking this person like who they're accountable to and what kind of accountable leadership they're going to provide in this role, or how they're accountable to their constituencies if they're a nonprofit group. Because we make the grants to 501c3s, but it's not, 501c3s is not the community. So I just wanted to make that distinction. I think that could lead to some kind of behavioral change at different levels. When we work in foundations, some of us say, well, I work in operations, or I don't work in the grant making part. That's fine. Foundations give out money in all kinds of different ways. Where we pay rent, who are our vendors. So I would also please ask us to stop hiring these national or international global consulting firms that charge like $500 an hour, and then say to them, can I pay you $500 an hour to train my staff in DEI? It's like, who are your vendors? Who are the people that are coming in all of the different roles? Like, who's catering? Like, who are you paying to clean the office? So there are all kinds of decisions that we get to make in these roles, where money is flowing in constant different ways. It's also true if you have any say at all in how the endowment funds get invested. So who are your investment managers? Who are the portfolio managers? Are they actually investing in grassroots solutions? So that's a couple of ways that we can, and then behaviorally, no matter what position or title we have in any foundation, we have to acknowledge that there's a power dynamic in just having a job in one of these institutions, right? So how fast do we answer an email that's unsolicited? Do we return phone calls? Like, what's sort of the hierarchy of our attention? And I think that is one of the ways that I think that we can look at individual behavior. We're also talking about obviously systems and infrastructure change and all kinds, but sometimes when at the end of a session like this, we're like, well, I don't know how I'm gonna change my entire system. Like, I work at Ford Foundation, but what am I gonna do, So I think there are ways, to show up differently and to promote the kinds of choices that we are all at choice all the time about sort of what we pay attention to, whose experience we honor, who we get to the table. So those are just a few. I'm sure there's a lot more out there, but I wanted to name that there are a few kinds of ways we can walk the walk, even if we're not the president, the CEO, or the trustee. And I think that's probably all I need to say, because I am now standing between you and wine and selfies. So on behalf of all these wonderful organizations, we just want to thank both of you for giving this to us. It's a gift.